I'm not talking about penguins, like those that star in Happy Feet or help the animals of the Central Park Zoo escape to Madagascar. I'm talking about pangolins. Easily my favorite animal, and one of the most fascinating creatures we share our own way. They may look like an armadillo to some, but pangolins, more closely related to dogs and cats, are incredibly unique. They're hard to describe, and I think that's why they're so unknown. There's 8 species of pangolins, 4 in Asia and 4 in Africa. And all of the Asian species and 3 of the African species have already had their fate essentially sealed, and probably will go extinct within the next few years. But even the most common species, the Temminck's ground pangolin, is incredibly rare. For many naturalists, this species is the holy grail of African wildlife. Now, in the Swallow Reserve in South Africa, a researcher named Wendy Pineno is trying to find out more about these creatures. Because they're so incredibly rare and so difficult to find, we know very little about their ecology and their behavior. We also don't know exactly how many of them are left. But Wendy is working to solve some of these mysteries. She's found that climate change is already affecting pangolin ecology. As the climate warms and proportionally gets much drier, insects become harder to find, and pangolins therefore have to spend more time out of their burrows, searching for insects, and therefore are more exposed to risks and will be more at risk to an earlier mortality. When we think of climate change, we think of it on a really broad scale. But it's important to know that it is affecting even these little guys like pangolins. Wendy also works to rehabilitate poached animals in the reserve. And on the trail of one particular pangolin, we followed the trail for miles, around obstacles like bushes and a giraffe, and at the end, we found an odd shape in the sand that was very strange because it seemed that this pangolin had simply vanished. And upon discussing with Wendy, we found that this pangolin had been poached originally, and although it was rescued and attempted to be reintroduced back into the reserve, the initial stress was too great, and this pangolin did not survive. And Wendy was forced to remove the body so the scales would not be taken. And the scales that run along the entire back of the pangolin are probably its most distinctive feature. Over millions of years of evolution, they provide a supreme barrier when things like lions want to play past the pangolin. But unfortunately, these scales are not sufficient when poachers come after this species. I held one of these scales that belonged to a recently poached female, and I was surprised because it's incredibly light. And I couldn't even begin to fathom how many of these scales were necessary to make up the 15-ton shipments that are being intercepted by customs officials. Sadly, these scales are thought of by some to have traditional medicinal properties. They're used in dozens of medicines to cure everything from cancer to arthritis to hysterical crying. And although they obviously have no medicinal value, what's crazier is that massive pharmaceutical companies paint a picture and use these scales, marketing them to the public as a medicine that is sufficient and works properly. And even some people that understand that pangolin scales are not a sufficient medicine use it as a status symbol and brag about it as they would a fancy car. And this has fueled a massive public demand. And to reach this point, we have a massive black market trade that has unfolded. And now pangolins, after 80 million years of evolution, are still incredibly susceptible to this risk. Every 5 minutes, recent estimates show, a pangolin is taken from the wild. Imagine that at the end of that Office episode, 4 pangolins have been taken from the wild. Now, I know this is really heavy stuff, and sometimes it's hard for me to stay positive when thinking about this. And the only way for me to be hopeful and optimistic about these guys is to think about the success stories. At another reserve called Pinda, also in South Africa, they're attempting to rehabilitate and reintroduce pangolins for the first time. Rampy was an orphan pangolin and his mother was taken by poachers when he was very young. He was still riding on her back as young pangolins do, and therefore was very vulnerable. But he was brought to Pinda, and he had a caretaker when I first met him. She would carry him around, put him on feeding spots, and break open the ground, releasing millions of ants so he could feed. And when he was fed up, he would stand on his back legs and crawl at her feet and ask to be carried to the next spot. And at night, she would take him back to her room and give him milk and the motherly care that he once would have had. And soon, Rampy will be the first wild pangolin on Pinda since over 50 years ago when they were first hunted out. Now, when I look in those beady, beautiful eyes, you can tell that there's something worth saving inside them. Pangolins are at a serious risk. And if we can't figure out, excuse me. And it can be hard to stay, excuse me, and it can be hard to stay optimistic about pangolins. And these success stories, like Rampy, give us some shred of hope in this idea. Now, today, as climate change is making world headlines, you've probably heard that we're entering the 6th mass extinction. Now, this term is thrown around a lot, and you may not know what it actually means. Well, in a normal geological period, extinctions are an incredibly unusual event. In a human lifetime, we certainly would not see one of these events, and we probably wouldn't even know what this phenomenon means. But today, now that humans have pushed extinction rates thousands of times higher than they should be, some figures estimate that 200 species go extinct every single day. And this is not a difficult figure to imagine, with things like the Amazon fires ripping through the most biodiverse places on Earth. Now, it may seem insignificant if one species goes extinct. I mean, there's millions of them, so we can't possibly need all of them, right? Well, let's take pangolins as an example of a keystone species. A keystone species is one that has an impact on its environment greater than its biomass would indicate. And as in the case of pangolins, they feed on insects, like particularly ants and termites, and therefore maintain insect populations and control the overall health of the ecosystem, especially the plant life. And it's important to know that pangolins live everywhere from the Congo Basin to the Kalahari Desert to the islands of the Philippines. And it's impossible to know what would happen if we remove something like pangolins from the ecosystem. But one can infer that it would be serious ecological consequences. Now, if we look a little broader, biodiversity is the system that our Earth has developed over billions of years of evolution to maintain every living thing that exists. It's the system that keeps us alive, and it's the system that allows us to do what we do. For me, it helps to think of biodiversity as a massive Jenga tower. Every block is inherently important to the stability of the entire tower, but some are particularly important. But unfortunately, we don't know which ones those are until they're gone. And if we treat these blocks as endangered species, and every time we take a block out of the tower, we're pushing a species into extinction, we can infer that a collapse is imminent if we continue on this path. So, how did we get here? How is it possible that one species is able to alter the fate of hundreds of thousands of species? How is it possible that the most intelligent being that has ever walked on the planet of the Earth is destroying its only home and the support system that keeps it alive? Conservation stories and tales of near extinctions are wide-ranging. You may have heard that orangutans are facing a deforestation risk as their rainforest home is turned into palm oil. You may have heard that rhino poaching has increased by 10,000% in just the past 10 years as the demand for their horn, which some see as a status symbol like the pangolin scales, has skyrocketed. You may have heard that sea turtles are at a risk of an ever-present plastic pollution problem. And the list goes on. But these stories, that take up the majority of the public eye, don't even begin to illustrate the ecological crisis that we're facing. Hundreds of thousands of species, like the pangolin, are facing imminent extinction, and yet most of their stories are virtually unknown. Let's take the vaquita, for example. The vaquita is the world's smallest whale, and its story has been hidden for decades. There's only 15 of them swimming around in the Sea of Cortez. Can you imagine if your entire species could sit around a harkness table? And this species is so endangered because in the same area lives a fish called a totuaba. And some believe that this fish has a swim bladder that, of all things, is a fertility cure. And because of this, local traffickers, which call this fish the cocaine of the sea because it's more valuable than any drug or gold trade, have fished for the totuaba illegally, and these massive nets that they put out also kill the vaquitas. And these traffickers have marketed and painted this swim bladder as a medicine, even though, like the pangolin scales, we know that they don't actually have any medicinal value. What could be more immoral than letting a species slip into extinction simply for something as trivial as human greed? Our threats to this planet are wide-ranging. Some are direct, like specifically targeting a species for a medicine that doesn't work, which I'm sure pangolins and vaquitas would tell you very well. Or some may seem more indirect, whether it's habitat destruction or climate change. But even these may have an even greater threat further down the line. But it's not all doom and gloom. And if we're going to save wildlife, the most important thing is to be hopeful, optimistic, and to maintain a positive attitude. Wildlife wants to go forward. Life wants to go on. Nature is resilient. And perhaps the best example of this resilience is in the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine. It's the site of our worst ever nuclear disaster. And it was declared uninhabitable for 20,000 years. But in its ashes, an entire primary forest ecosystem developed, and on top of that, everything from wolves to moose have set up an entirely coherent ecosystem. And these species are thriving so well in an environment that we require complex radiation suits to access, simply because we're not there. Because wildlife is resilient, we need to have hope. We need a call to action, and we need effort. We need to stop unnecessarily using wildlife before it's too late. And we need to understand that these stories need to be spread, because we need to give everyone hope. If we want to brace for climate change and do the same for our planet, we need to maintain the ecosystem. And the only way to do that is to keep biodiversity intact. And the only way to do that is to keep wildlife thriving and alive. So I'll leave you with one last message. Although nature doesn't need people, people definitely need nature. So when we work to save species and we spread this message, understand that we're saving ourselves. Thank you.